Hi everyone, it's Robert Weissman. We're going to get going with this day after the election webinar. I'm going to give a presentation. It'll take 25 minutes or so with the slides and the accompanying audio. We can take and will take questions at the end. You can send them to us in the course of the conversation. We will not be able to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. With me making this presentation today is Angela Bradbury from our communications team, and Tom Backery and Jerry Reichalt from our information technology team to help make sure this goes as smoothly as possible. So let's dive right in. I know a lot of you probably had the late night last night waiting for the returns to come in. And I know a lot of people are probably feeling frustrated and depressed. I think that makes sense and it's appropriate. What I wanted to do in this presentation today is try to provide some context for what happened, so we can not wallow in the depression, but try to analyze what's going on as a way to figure out ways forward and describe how public citizen we're going to try to address the new political terrain that we face. So to begin, let's just an overview of the areas that I want to cover. The first is to give some context, focusing on the economy and the policies of the Obama administration, and I think explain why the election turned out the way it did in large part. Second, to look at the money that flowed into this campaign, which is really unprecedented. Analyze a little bit where it came from, but also how it affected the election. Talk about what the consequences are going to be of the newly configured Congress and reflect on some of what happened in the election and what the new political terrain looks like. And then finally discuss how public citizens are going to respond and how I hope that we all can respond to make the best we can with this much more difficult environment and really turn it ultimately to our advantage. So let's begin the conversation. Thinking back 2 years, which seems like an eternity in many ways in the 24-hour news cycle, but I think that's where we need to start. President Obama was elected. He was ushered in with a very significant mandate and a deep level of enthusiasm in the electorate that was unlike anything we've seen in at least a generation. He came then with a lot of political momentum. At the same time, he took office with an economy that was collapsing, and the economy remains in very perilous condition. But it's important to remember also the trend at the time that the president came in and how sharp the downturn was. We were really entering and remain in the worst recession since the Great Depression. And I think the first bullet point here is in some ways the most important fact about this election, more important than what anybody did or said or how they positioned or any issue about health care or anything else, which is that we have roughly 10% of the country unemployed according to official measures. About 1 in 6 people, according to official measures, who are seeking full-time work are not able to find one. And if you've got that many people out of work, you're going to have a very restive electorate, and there's almost a certainty that the incumbent party is going to face defeat in the next election unless they do a series of things which I will describe the Democrats did not do. Along with the unemployment, we have a foreclosure crisis. Now, these two things are interrelated, but they're separate. And it is important to remember how serious the foreclosure crisis is, how needless it is, and how it's disrupted millions of families and communities across the country. And that also is part of the background terrain that makes it such a difficult time for incumbents, no matter what else was going on. Besides these sort of initial manifestations, or these surface manifestations of the economic problem, the president took office with very deep structural problems that demanded some kind of remedy and some program to be addressed. The housing bubble popped, of course, shortly before the president took office. That not only affected the foreclosure problem and the housing market, but it had a very substantial effect on the overall economy. The increasing wealth that people had in their homes was enabling them to borrow money, and that was what had been fueling the consumer side of the economy. So the bursting of the housing bubble eradicated an enormous amount of wealth and also plunged the country directly into the recession. Relatedly, the housing bubble had fueled the growth of the financial sector and, of course, the construction industry, and those had been the drivers of the national economy over the last decade. Those two drivers of the national economy were gone once the bubble popped and remain gone and have no prospect of returning. We also had a country that's witnessed a massive increase in wealth and income inequality over the last 30, 35 years. That's an unfortunate and really serious fact for well-being of the country, but it also has a direct economic problem, which is that most of the country does not have sufficient purchasing power to fuel the economy. Now, people worked around that by accumulating more and more debt, but after the housing bubble popped and after the banks fell into crisis, that was no longer an available avenue to maintain consumer purchasing power. And last, and this isn't really last, but the last point I want to emphasize here is we had a chronic trade deficit, which meant that our manufacturing capacity has been hollowed out, and a lot of the source of good-paying jobs for working people have been eliminated. So it was not going to be easily the case for the president to create a new basis for a well-functioning economy. So faced with these enormous challenges, the president was called upon to make and put forward a very bold program. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. But I think it's pretty clear in retrospect, as it was actually pretty clear at the time what was called for. We needed a major investment program to replace the failure of the private sector in investment. We had a stimulus program that was probably about half as large as it should have been, but we need something that was much bigger. We needed directly to take on the foreclosure crisis with a program to keep people in their homes and avoid having them needlessly thrown out. We've got a situation now with people being thrown out of homes, but those homes remaining unoccupied. And then finally, we had to take care of the problem in the credit markets and deal directly with the collapse of the banking sector. Now, the president and the administration made choices in all these areas, but they, I think, unfortunately weren't the right choices or weren't sufficiently aggressive choices. What we had needed when the president came in was a really bold populist program to very aggressively take on these problems that we just outlined. And these would have been politically ambitious, but they were also policy necessary, and it was important that the president go big to deal with a very severe economic problem that he was facing. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. The stimulus was too small. It's probably about half the size that it should have been. Too much of the money was devoted to tax breaks and a fruitless effort to try to gain Republican support, and it went on for too short a period of time. What we should have had was an aggressive investment program, specifically in alternative energy and renewables and efficiency, as well as maintaining workers in state and local government. The housing program from the administration was small and failed to do anything whatsoever to keep people in their homes. And the administration continues to be very reluctant to embrace the obvious and necessary solution to this problem, which is to reduce the principal owed by people who are living in homes that are underwater, where they owe more on their mortgage and the value of their home. And instead of taking on the banks, the president and the Obama and his administration embraced the Bush administration's bank bailout. Now, there was an alternative course available, which was, at minimum, to impose very severe conditions on the banks as a quid pro quo for receiving assistance from the federal government. That would have included everything from major restrictions on executive compensation to dealing with mandates for provision of credit. There's a very strong case to be made that the government should have nationalized, just taken over some of these banks that clearly would have failed but for federal assistance. That's not what the administration did. It really continued with the Bush administration program. Now, that was, I think, bad policy, as I'm explaining, but it also had very major political consequences. It framed the public understanding of everything that came subsequently. It made the administration appear to be engaged in deal making, taking care of insiders, and paying more attention to the banking sector, to the corporate sector, than to the needs of people. So the contrast between bailing out the banks and the failure to deal with the home foreclosure crisis was very acute in communities across the country. But this idea of the administration as a deal maker and focused on insiders would, I think, shade everything that came afterwards, and was a very important part of the public resistance that grew to the administration, often and for reasons that didn't really make any sense at all. Let's turn now to looking at what happened in the actual campaign and all of the corporate money that flowed in. So having just covered some sense of the context, of course, there are a lot of things that have happened in the last 2 years. I haven't even touched on healthcare, but let's move on now and just look a little bit at what happened with the campaign and how corporate money shaped what went on. Citizens United, the Federal Elections Commission, was, of course, decided by the Supreme Court in January of this year, and that framed election 2010. It meant very specifically that corporations would be free to spend whatever they wanted from their own treasuries to influence the outcome of the election. Corporations are very happy to accept the invitation by the Supreme Court to spend, and they did. But the case had an impact that went even beyond freeing up corporations, which was to signal to corporations, but also to billionaires and everyone involved in sort of all the deep pockets, that the old rules of campaign finance restrictions were cast to the wayside. We now had Wild West rules. Almost anything would go, and whoever could spend the most was likely to win, as turned out to be the case. We saw the rise of what became known as super PACs, outside groups that spent huge amounts of money and ultimately dominated in very considerable ways the campaign in 2010. Outside group spending, when all of it's totaled, is going to exceed more than $300 million spent by about 150 organizations. 8 out of the top 10 were Republican-only groups. They spent their money only to support Republicans or primarily supported Republicans. The money that these outside groups spent will ultimately turn out to be more than the political parties spent. And unlike the parties, these groups are largely unknown, and they're almost totally unaccountable in any way. So these were really freelance operating entities with a decisive impact over the campaign. We saw the creation of all kinds of these super PACs, different kinds of constructs under the IRS tax code to funnel money into the election. I call them the faux Americans because so many of these organizations took these ridiculous names, invoking either that they were Americans or citizens, even though there were no actual Americans involved in these organizations. So we have everything from Americans for Prosperity to the American Future Fund. American Solutions is the Newt Gingrich operation. Where did all the money come from that went into these independent groups that spent $300 or more million in the election that just concluded? A lot of it came from the energy sector. The Koch brothers, K-O-C-H is Koch, were major funders and movers and organizers in driving all the money into these new organizations. They run the largest private corporation in the United States. They are each individually billionaires. Among the other enterprises that they funded is Americans for Prosperity. Americans for Prosperity announced it was going to spend $50 million in this election cycle. They reported spending far less. That may be because they spent their money in ways that aren't required to be reported to the Federal Elections Commission, or maybe they spent much less, but it's clear that the Kochs, directly through Americans for Prosperity and through other means, spent major sums in this election. And they weren't the only segment of the energy industry to pour millions into campaign 2010. The Chamber of Commerce was a major conduit for funding into the election. They were the leading independent organization spending in 2010. The Chamber has now really emerged as almost a third party in the American political scene. They announced they were going to spend $75 million in this election cycle. They were up to around only $31 million in terms of federal election expenditures by the end of October. The final number will certainly be higher. And they may actually hit $75 million with not all of their expenditures required to be reported to the FEC. The Chamber likes to portray itself as broadly representative of small business interests across the country, but in fact they represent big business. Their budget comes primarily from a relatively handful of corporations. The New York Times recently reported that 45 companies gave half of the overall budget for the Chamber in 2008. There's every reason to think that that's the normal pattern at the Chamber. Now, the Chamber tilts Republican always. It's generally can traditionally spread its money a bit more evenly than it did in this past election. In election 2010, it seems that maybe 90% of their funding went to support Republicans. Where did the money go? Well, it primarily went to attack ads. Now, there's a school of thought that attack ads are a waste of time and don't work, but that is a mistaken school. That school should be closed down. The attack ads do work, and the reason that people run negative ads is because they work. There's a lot of evidence for that. Among their features of attack ads is that they turn people off to the electoral process. So they can dampen turnout from people who are less committed. That's one of the ways that they're very effective. They work most effectively from unaccountable organizations like all of these outside groups that put money into this past race. If you are a candidate and you run a negative attack ad, you can at least be held accountable. The ad may work, but there may be a reaction against you for having run this nasty ad. If you are the American Action Fund or American Solutions or Americans for Prosperity, who knows what that is, you can't possibly be held accountable. So you get all the benefits from running an attack ad without any of the negatives. The money that came in was also veiled in secrecy in this election in ways that had never been seen before. This is Karl Rove on the left, and thumbing his nose at you, and Ed Gillespie, former chair of the Republican National Committee. The two of them got together and decided to create something called American Crossroads, which turned out to be one of the biggest of the independent spenders, not counting the Chamber of Commerce. Now, when they set up American Crossroads, they announced they were going to raise $50 million for this election, and the money started to come in slowly. So what they decided to do was set up a sister organization called Crossroads GPS. Crossroads GPS seems to be exactly the same as American Crossroads in every respect, except that it's organized under a different portion of the tax code, which meant that it was not required to disclose its funders. Then suddenly, the money started flowing in to Crossroads GPS. Now, ultimately, American Crossroads was able to raise a lot of money too, but that little story indicates the importance of the secrecy that surrounded the funding in this last election. A lot of funders were willing to come in if they weren't going to be disclosed. And again, American Crossroads evidencing the influence of dirty energy money. They had a $2 million direct contribution from Alliance Resource Group, a coal company in Appalachia. Overall, we saw disclosure decline very significantly in this election. 6 and 4 years ago, we had almost full disclosure of all funders to independent organizations. This year, though, we're down around 1/3 of all the money being contributed to the independent organizations being disclosed. Very small number of donors were responsible for most of the money that went in to these independent organizations. We did an analysis as of mid-October. Only 0.09% of the donors had accounted for half of the disclosed contributions to the outside groups. Just 106 donations counted as much as another 114,000 almost combined. So a very small number of corporations and deep-pocketed billionaires were really driving this process. Now, $300 million is a lot of money, obviously, but it's even more than it seems like when you understand that the outside groups did not have to spread their money equally across the 50 states. They were able to focus on tight races. So they had able to leverage that $300 million to be even more efficient. A good example of how they focused their money is in the Colorado Senate election, where overall total of more than $15 million was spent by outside organizations in a relatively small state. American Crossroads and Crossroads GPS threw in $6 million. The Economic Libertarian Club for Growth, really a corporate front group, threw in $1 million. Chamber of Commerce spent almost $2 million, and those numbers will probably rise by the time we get final data from the Federal Elections Commission. Now, another important feature of what happened from these outside organizations is targeted attacks at individuals for specific things that they had done to affect corporate interests. And I think this is a harbinger of what we're going to see in the future as a result of the Citizens United decision. This is Peter DeFazio, a representative from Oregon, very progressive member. He found himself suddenly victimized by a harsh advertising campaign from something called Concerned Taxpayers of America. They entered only 2 races. They spent money in only 2 races. Half of their funding appears to have come from a hedge fund mogul by the name of Bob Mercer. He spent $350,000, donated $350,000 to this entity. Now, it's not really clear what Bob Mercer's grievance is against Peter DeFazio, but it is possible, just possible, that his concern was that DeFazio had introduced the Let Wall Street Pay for the Restoration of Main Street Act. That was a proposal that would have imposed a tax on all financial speculation, something that Public Citizen strongly supports, and would have affected Bob Mercer directly. Now, DeFazio came out of this election okay, but the message from this, the lesson from this kind of spending is if you take on particular corporate interests in this post-Citizens United world, you're going to have to be willing to face down very large spending against you. That's obviously going to chill elected officials across the country, and including especially in state and local contexts. Now, as a last word, we should say that labor money is no match whatsoever for the corporate cash that entered this election, so there's no saving grace there. Business contributions were going to outdistance labor money in this election by an 18-to-1 ratio. In some ways, that's slightly overstated. Some labor money is probably not counted. Some of the money that's counted as corporate money might not reasonably be attributed to corporations, but you certainly get a sense of the magnitude by that 18-to-1 ratio. There's no way the labor money offset what big business put in. So where are we now? What do we have to deal with? Well, John Boehner is going to become the Speaker of the House, almost for sure. John Boehner is a nasty figure. He once distributed checks on behalf of the tobacco industry on the floor of the House of Representatives. He has mocked the idea of regulations to protect people, and he's going to try to carry forward a very harmful agenda. We also lost some real champions last night, including Senator Russ Feingold from Wisconsin, who was defeated. Feingold, of course, stands for so many of the things that the Tea Party says they care about, but he's lost office, and we've really lost a champion with Feingold's defeat. And a number of other leading progressives went down yesterday. So we're going to have a worse Congress in that regard as well. I wanted to interject with a few thoughts about the Tea Party, which I think is a very mixed and sort of incoherent story. People impute maybe too much certainty to what the Tea Party is and what it stands for and what it did. But with that in mind, just a couple of comments. First is that the agenda of the Tea Party is itself incoherent and contradictory, and that the Tea Party is not an organized entity in any meaningful sense. That's not to say it's not a consequential one, but there are not. The Washington Post did a very good investigation. It turns out that most of the entities that claim to be Tea Party affiliated are small and lack any significant funding, and many of them aren't even engaged in electoral politics at all. That said, there are some national organizing efforts that are very well supported, backed by the Koch brothers and oil money. Some of them organized through Dick Armey's outfit, and they have been able to give expression to some of the frustration that people feel and channel it into some very confused and harmful and actually pro-corporate policies and engagement in the electoral sphere. There's no question that there was an expression of racism in the Tea Party. It's not to say that everybody in the Tea Party was a racist or that was the driving feature of the Tea Party movement, but there's been a little bit of a revisionist history in the last few months to ignore that fact, but it's a feature of American society that we shouldn't ignore, and it's a serious one that we've got to address and grapple with. Now, as much as the Tea Party was able to achieve on behalf of Republicans, they also hurt them in some very direct way. The Republicans basically sacrificed 2 Senate seats they almost certainly would have won in Delaware and Nevada. if Tea Party extremists had not been able to win Republican primaries. That said, there was the Tea Party movement gave expression to real anger and helped generate momentum for the Republicans they might not otherwise have had, and they overall for sure helped the general Republican surge. Now there's a conflict embedded in the Tea Party with the overall Republican Party, which is the grassroots movement proclaims a commitment to a variety of things, again, some of them self-contradictory, but a lot of them directly conflict with the corporate agenda of the mainstream Republican Party. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, and it's going to be a challenge for us in Public Citizen and others to try to reach out to whatever components of the Tea Party movement we can and develop anti-corporate coalitions in Congress. Now, with Boehner in charge of the House and champions like Feingold out, what are we going to face in practical terms? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is unhappy as people maybe feel, it's important to remember that the reactionary Republican elements only control one house. They don't control the Senate, and they don't control the White House. So it's easy to feel overwhelmed today, but it's also important to have some perspective about the real balance of power. Now, because they have less actual power and don't have the ability to push through whatever they want, it's a safe bet that the House Republicans are going to push a variety of extremist policies, pro-corporate, deregulatory policies, and a lot of very damaging budgetary and anti-spending policies. There'll probably be some symbolic efforts to try to roll back the health care law and Wall Street reform, although those are going to go nowhere. The greatest power for the Republicans in the House is going to be on spending issues, where both the House and Senate, of course, must affirmatively approve new spending before it can take place. So they do have in that area a de facto veto. In addition to focusing on the spending area, one of the most worrisome areas to watch is going to be the effort to have some bipartisan, so-called bipartisan agreement, which will likely move around pro-corporate deals. Areas where we may see this effort would involve new free trade agreements or harmful energy policy, particularly support for nuclear power. Those are areas, of course, where Public Citizen spends a lot of energy. We're going to be focusing a lot on that, but they happen to be objectively the areas where there's reason to be concerned about these damaging coalitions taking place on behalf of corporations. Now, it's also possible, as I mentioned before, that we're going to be able to have citizen coalitions among both progressives and some of these Tea Party movements and allies in Congress to fashion coalitions that will be able to defeat corporate interests and advance positive policies. And ironically, the same two issues offer possibilities for us, both on trade and on energy, as I'll talk about in a moment, and in the area of corporate subsidies, where the Tea Party has certainly campaigned heavily against bailouts and subsidies for big business. A couple thoughts on how the Democrats did in the election. I think the most important factor is that they, given what they had not done in the 2 years they were in office, they faced objective challenges that were going to be almost impossible to overcome. This was going to be a change election. I think they did fight hard. I think people often were frustrated with the Democrats in years past. It seemed like they didn't really fight. I think this time it's not a fair criticism. They did fight hard. That said, there's still a lot to criticize what they did do. It's hard to say, at least certainly at the national level, they put forward a coherent message of what they were for. They were clearly against returning to Bush policies, but it wasn't so clear what they were for. They were inconsistent in articulating the things that they might have been for, or they were really going to try to tackle and take on directly. So they were reluctant in many cases to embrace populist messaging, having been reluctant to embrace populist policies in the previous 4 years. Polling by Stan Greenberg and James Carville had indicated that even in the last weeks of the election, a populist message that took on the oil companies, corporate lobbyists, and focused especially on offshoring was able to move the electorate by a number of points. And I think in general, we saw these issues come up in the election. We didn't see that coherently done by the Democrats. Now last, what can we do? What do we need to do in the face of election 2010? The first thing is we're going to block the corporate agenda that's going to be put forward. Again, as I said, it's going to come full force in the House, but the real risk is going to be where there's going to be deals reaching across the aisle on behalf of powerful corporate interests. We are not going to stomach deregulation or rollback of existing regulations. We're going to have some hard fights to make sure that agencies are appropriately funded so they can do their jobs. One of the leverage points of the House Republicans will certainly be to try to defund agencies or enforcement efforts within agencies. We're going to have some hard fights over tax policy. Not traditionally an area where Public Citizen is focused, although we've done some work in that area, and I think we'll probably do some more. There's going to be a lot of talk about cutting Social Security and unreasonable talk about cutting deficits and forsaking vital public investments. We're going to have to investigate whether that's an appropriate area for Public Citizen to engage, and we'll be talking to you about all of that, talking to all of you about that as the months unfold. But it's for sure going to be a crucial part of the political terrain. And again, we're going to have to prevent these dangerous bipartisan agreements that might come forward. We're also, as I said, going to try to seek opportunities to do things affirmatively to advance our agenda for health and safety and justice. There's a big opportunity, notwithstanding the dangers, to do some good things to address the problems of offshoring and the deep trade deficit. Some polling right before the election indicated that the threat of offshoring is now perceived across the country through all sectors as a really serious part of our economic problems, and there's a lot of energy to try to deal with that affirmatively. There's a possibility, and at least has to be explored, that we can make some forward movements on different transparency rules for the Congress, particularly in the area of earmarks, where we've just recently entered into a right-left coalition. There may be some opportunities for getting new money into energy efficiency and renewables, hopefully without, and will vitally be on our part to work against, including nuclear in that package. And again, I think there's opportunities to try to prevent additional bailouts and corporate subsidies. Now, we're also going to have to move forward to address this corrupt campaign system that has burdened us for so long, but which is now much worse than it's been any time in the past generation. We're going to have to redouble our efforts around Fair Elections Now Act and getting disclosure, although there's no question that's going to involve a movement-building effort rather than short-term legislative efforts in the next Congress. And we're also going to have to directly go after the Citizens United decision. I think we're going to have new opportunities to work for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and to return elections and the First Amendment to the people. This election was so serious that it's really highlighted all the predictions that we had, all the warnings we had issued about Citizens United. I think a growing movement is going to be ready to take this thing on directly. I think members of Congress, who may have been reluctant to talk about a constitutional amendment, are going to now recognize that it is vital if they're going to rescue democracy and maybe even their jobs to have such an amendment. I think we're going to see a lot more support in the months ahead and the next couple of years ahead. I think we have a real opportunity to build a large-scale movement, and that's what it's going to be. We're going to do work in Congress on a constitutional amendment, but this is going to be a ground-up effort. We're going to have to build across the country if we're going to make this thing happen. Now, very practically, we are trying to build that movement. We've got an organizer on board who you can contact if you want to follow up on Citizens United work, Anna White. You can email her at awhite@citizen.org. She can connect you with a variety of volunteer options, everything from sending emails to your friends to holding house parties to working on local and state resolutions supporting the idea of a constitutional amendment. And I think altogether we're going to be able to pull this thing off. Our website for further information about a constitutional amendment remains don'tgetrolled.org. We will be rolling out a new website in the months ahead. We'll let you know about that. But for now, you can always touch base there for additional information. So I thank you very much for your time. That went a little bit longer than I anticipated, but we've got some time for questions, and let's turn to that. Angela Bradbury is with me, and she's going to direct questions to me. Our first question is from David. He asks, won't the Supreme Court intervene and thwart any legislative effort to curtail corporate influence? Well, if that's a question about campaign finance reform, I think there are a range of things that we can do, even with a hostile Supreme Court, including first, getting passage of disclosure rules. And of course, if we have a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, that is directly taking on the court and overcoming the problem posed by the court itself. The next question comes from Jane, who asks, how is it possible to propose a constitutional amendment to stop corporate money with this new Congress? There's no question that we don't have a Congress that's going to be amenable to passing a constitutional amendment, but this is going to be a building process. And I think we're going to have more support in this coming Congress than we would have been able to achieve in the past Congress. No, we're not going to be at the point of winning 2/3 support from both the House and the Senate in the near future. But I think we're going to be able to build more support given this current configuration and given this recent experience than we would have been able to do with the prior Congress. And how do we get to the 2/3? Well, we're never going to get to the 2/3 just with an inside strategy, just by lobbying members of Congress. That's going to require the grassroots movement that I talked about. And that's how real change happens. It doesn't happen from inside work. It comes from citizen movements that can shift the overall frame of what seems reasonable and possible. And I think we now have a moment in time where we're called upon to build a movement that can achieve that. Even if it seems like an uphill fight, it is something that we can do. The next question comes from Lori. She's in Davis, California. She asks, the best solution to corporate power seems to be public financing of elections, but I can't see it passing a liberal Congress, let alone this one. Thoughts? I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's going to be very hard in this Congress to win public financing. That said, we should acknowledge that we achieved something in this prior Congress that we hadn't done before. We had the public financing bill, FENA, the Fair Elections Now Act, achieved more support in the House and Senate than it had ever done before. It was voted out of committee in the House successfully. We were relatively close to getting it put forward in the full House. There's still a tiny chance that'll happen in the lame duck session. So we do have momentum for this, and it's going to, this is a big one too. This is not a small bill. We're going to have to try to continue to build momentum for it as well. It's wrong to write off Republicans on these kinds of issues, even if we acknowledge that it's going to be hard to win them over. So I think we're going to keep working in this current Congress. But the work now is also not just about this immediate Congress, but it's also about what we can do in the next one. If we're able to build more momentum, then maybe the next one will be able to deliver it for us if the current one's unable to. Brooke asks a question, is there any concrete evidence at this point that this election will help build opposition to Citizens United? And I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, it's hard to know what concrete evidence means in this context, but there is very broad understanding, certainly in the political class, of the impact of Citizens United on how the election played out. And I think a lot of people thought when the decision was issued this past January that some of the warnings from groups like Public Citizen were hyperbolic. And I think it's no longer the case. This election has actually been worse than I would have predicted it was going to be in the wake of Citizens United. I think that's broadly understood. Among the broad public, there is massive opposition to Citizens United. We've seen 80% of the people in multiple polls indicate they disapprove of the decision. And depending on where you live in the country, people experience this in a very visceral way. They were subjected to these nonstop television ads, and I think they want to do something about it. No one thinks this is healthy for democracy. Alexander asks, we need an easy-to-market and digest message to combat the government is the enemy mantra and emphasize that the real problem is corporate power. Is Public Citizen working on this kind of message? Yes. And you frame it really well, Alexander, so I think we'll try to do something directly in response to your question. I think we are going to see a lot of this, we're going to see it played out in issue after issue where we're going to put forward that kind of the frame that you're talking about. We're going to see this issue posed generically in the context of regulation, where we're going to see a lot of Republican attacks on the idea of regulation itself. Or this pure, is the problem the government, or is the problem the corporations, and the fact that the corporations run the government is exactly right, and we'll try to be responsive to your question and suggestion as well. Tom says that ABC election coverage had a segment with this spin that outside campaign spending for Democrats and Republicans had just a slight edge to Republicans, but was roughly equal. Is that baloney? I didn't see that segment, so I can't say directly. The outside spending was overwhelmingly for Republicans. Democrats, as the incumbent party, at least until the end, had an advantage in the direct funding for candidates and for the party committees. But among the outside groups, the money went overwhelmingly to Republicans. Lori asks a question: are liberal groups getting together to plan like the conservative groups? It seems like there's a duplication of effort and a waste of resources. I'd love to see some coordination. I think progressive groups coordinate all the time. Of course, we can do better. Everybody can always do better. There may be a little bit of a sense that the other side is better. The other side does coordinate. The Koch brothers really brought together a lot of deep-pocketed funders to coordinate their effort on this one. I think that the deep pockets on the liberal side actually don't coordinate quite as well. But by and large, I think there's reasonably good coordination. There may not be as much coordination on the biggest picture issues as there should be. And there's some tension in terms of how to deal with the Democratic administration. Public Citizen proudly maintains a very independent role no matter who is in office. Many liberal organizations, though, are reluctant to criticize the Democratic administration, and that makes some coordinating efforts a little bit more difficult. Linda asks how we can have a constitutional amendment that doesn't hurt nonprofits like Public Citizen. That's a very good question, Linda. Our answer is that we support a constitutional amendment that limits the ability of for-profit corporations, that specifies that for-profit corporations don't have First Amendment rights. We think that nonprofits, whether it's Public Citizen or whether it's the National Rifle Association, need to be treated categorically differently. Nonprofits really are a coming together of people for the purpose of expressing themselves politically, and that should be protected. That for-profit corporations don't serve that purpose and also have legal attributes and the ability to aggregate funds that makes them qualitatively different than nonprofits, and they're not just a grouping of regular people. Nancy asks, what could we have done about the Senate being too weak? That's a hard one to answer. I think the main thing always is that Democrats and Republicans, elected officials, whoever they are, respond to pressure. And sometimes there's a reluctance by some liberal organizations to pressure their friends, who they think are their friends or their sort of friends in the Congress and the administration. I think that leads them to do less than they would if they were under pressure. It's a mistake to overstate this, but it's also the case, I think, on the conservative side, that the right wing does push on Republican members of Congress, and we've certainly seen that with the Tea Party. They did not just put themselves forward as knee-jerk Republicans. They were ready to pressure and challenge Republicans who they thought weren't adhering to appropriate principle. Patsy asks, is there any thought that attack ads will work less well in the future with more savvy generations of voters? I don't think that's the case. Attack ads, at least so long as people watch television, are going to work. Most people are not deeply involved in politics. They don't spend most of their time thinking about policy issues and about electoral politics. And they can be, they get most of their information from television and from advertisements. And they can also be depressed in the sense of being tuning out. So you've got people who are unenthusiastic about an election and are subject to endless attack ads. Their likely reaction is to not vote. I don't think there's any evidence that attack ads are going to work less well. David asks, what would an amendment to overturn Citizens United look like? There's a lot of different possibilities. Our basic view is that the amendment should specify that for-profit corporations don't have First Amendment speech rights. We'd also like to see the amendment specify that Congress and the states have latitude to enact far-reaching campaign finance reform, including public financing, without being subjected to a First Amendment challenge. Mary asks, the other side appears better organized because they are funded by deep pockets with much larger megaphones. Do you agree? There's a lot to that. On the other hand, there's a lot of money on the Democratic side as well. I'm not sure this was an election that was lost by the Democrats because they were less well organized. That's chronically been a problem for the Democrats. My assessment of it is that this was one that was lost not because of organization, but because of the as I tried to explain in the presentation, because of the economy, the failure to explain why the economy was doing as badly as it was, and to take policy and to enact policies to improve it, and then later on top of that, all of the corporate money with attack ads. Michael asks, would Public Citizen ever consider independent expenditure campaigns in future elections? We wouldn't foreclose anything, but that's unlikely to be what we do. Among other reasons, it's not. We don't see evidence that we can muster enough money to make a difference doing that. But once you get involved in that kind of politicking, you lose some of your independence. You've really defined yourself in a way that's different than how Public Citizen has defined ourselves over the years. We value our independence. We're proudly progressive, but we are not partisan. And I think that's made us stronger, and we tend to stay that way. Glenn asks, what do you think the future of the Chamber of Commerce will be? Will the public still support it, or will they pull all the backing? Well, I think the Chamber of Commerce, unfortunately, is very bright. They're going to be able to brag about it, and I'm sure they're probably bragging today about a very effective expenditure. They've managed to raise huge amounts of money in the past 2 years, both for electoral politics and for lobbying. They are now at the scale of a separate party. They are a third force in American politics. They are backed by corporations, so the public doesn't support the Chamber of Commerce in any way. The public can't really influence the Chamber of Commerce in any direct way, although we're eager to work on campaigns to limit the influence of the Chamber. They have, as long as, their accountability, such as it is to a relatively small number of large corporations, and I think that they are, unfortunately, they've been delivering for those corporations, at least as they define their interests narrowly. Lisa asks, how can we contend with White House pressure to be or appear bipartisan in response to the election on corporate issues? I think that is a great question, and I think the challenge for everyone, for all progressives, is going to be to put forward a different version. It's not a matter of being bipartisan or not. It's a matter of adhering to principle, putting forward a vision, and adopting the right policies. I think it's also, it's sort of a little bit the narrative that the White House and the Democrats failed because they were insufficiently bipartisan is sort of embarrassingly laughable. If you look back all the way back to the stimulus, the administration worked very hard to gain Republican support, and there was no interest in trying to do deals, even when the administration would compromise basically with itself to try to bring Republicans on board. You've got Mitch McConnell, the leader in the Senate, saying his primary objective going forward is to make President Obama a one-term senator. It's not at all obvious how there's any room for being bipartisan in any meaningful way. On the other hand, as I mentioned, there's real danger of this happening exactly as you suggest, Lisa, in the areas that are of highest priority for corporations, or at least very high priority for corporations, on tax policy, on trade deals, and on energy. So we're going to have to be on guard with that. And the trick is for us not to be subjected to White House pressure, but to pressure the White House. And that's a job for Public Citizen. That's a job for everybody to do. And we'll try to organize everyone to be able to do that effectively. Margaret asks if we will issue a report with details about the price paid per vote and exactly who picked up the tab for each federally elected character. I'm not sure if we'll do exactly that, Margaret, although we'll give it a hard look. you can get, for direct contributions to the candidates, you can get very specific information from the Center for Responsive Politics at the website opensecrets.org. Opensecrets.org shows you who is contributing directly to each candidate. Steve asks, does Public Citizen take a stand on self-finance campaigns like Meg Whitman and others, or are we just concerned about for-profit corporations? I think, Steve, the problem of self-finance campaigns is a challenging one for any in the campaign finance area, because public financing approaches wouldn't solve the problem of billionaires running huge campaigns independent of any public financing scheme. There are obvious ways to deal with that problem, but the court has been very restrictive in permitting them on the grounds that billionaires should be able to spend whatever they want to promote themselves as a First Amendment issue. So I think this is one, we identify it as a problem. A real cure may require a constitutional amendment. Tom from Kansas City asks, do I have any thoughts on the need to lobby state legislatures and local officials on Anti-Citizens United Amendment and arguments to counter the idea that a constitutional amendment is too tall an order? I think that the primary fight right now is going to be at the state and local level to build support up into Congress. So I think that's going to be the primary emphasis of our campaign going forward. And we're going to talk more and more about the idea that constitutional amendment is too hard or unrealistic. It's a sort of self-reinforcing argument, and we hope that it can unravel itself as well. And people are overwhelmingly on board with the idea of a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. The main reluctance to embracing it, an effort on an amendment, is that it seems unrealistic. Well, if everybody who was supportive of the idea let go of the idea that it was unrealistic, we'd be a long way to getting there.